to introduce him. I'm going to introduce him here. He's currently a postdoctoral research fellow. He works for WSU, but he's based on the west side in Puyallup. He is funded by the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And as I understand it, his primary role is to direct the Forest Health Watch that is interested in forest health issues, why they're there, what is the health of different trees in the entire Pacific Northwest region. And Joey, if I have made mistakes there, you can correct me when you present. After earning a Bachelor's of Science at WSU, so right here, he earned a Master's of Science from jointly 2 departments at Oregon State University, botany and plant pathology, and then went to South Africa where he earned a PhD in plant pathology. Based on his CV, he has mentored a lot of students and often works with youth and adult citizens because he's very deeply committed to involving citizens in science, has been doing that kind of work for a long time and believes such efforts are really important, not only to communicating and helping people understand science, but also for our long-term biosecurity as people and the ecosystems we depend on. So we invited Joey to talk about the health of Western red cedar and the citizen science effort he's leading. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Joey.
Yeah, thank you, Penny. It is a true privilege and honor to be back here. And I will explain this a little bit, but Penny didn't mention that my very first field season in research and forestry was with her and Andy Hudak from the Mountain Research, or the Rocky Mountain Research Station there in Moscow. So it's really nice to come back after many, many years and lots of studying and learning about tree health and come back and share a presentation about the work we're doing with you again, Penny. But so this is a privilege on many personal levels, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to, and would be thrilled to do this again when we have some results and some updates to give about the red cedar. But happy tonight to just share an introduction to some of the work that's going on and some of the ways that we would love to hear your perspectives and opportunities to engage with us, but also to share how other community scientists are engaging with our research about red cedar dieback. So can you all see me okay and the presentation okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Very well. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to myself and the program that I'm at in Puyallup. Then we can talk about what's going on with red cedar. First, why red cedar is important, and then why we're concerned about the health of red cedar. And then we can talk about how community scientists are engaging through this program called Forest Health Watch. And at the end, I'd like to just summarize, why these engagements and how these community scientists are participating is really important, and how we're going to use this information to advance knowledge or accelerate research about the dieback. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm presenting tonight from Tacoma, my home in Tacoma, and I do a lot of work in learning and research in Puyallup, which is just east of Tacoma on the west side of Washington. And together I do all of my exploring and learning and a lot of fun, having fun on this traditional homelands of the Puyallup tribe of Indians. So I want to acknowledge that I'm super privileged to be here and experiencing these kind of ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples in the Northwest. And I just want to tip my hat to that that lineage and that legacy that I'm experiencing and contributing to. So as Penny mentioned, I spent some time in Pullman. My very first introduction to field work and forestry and research in natural systems is really first at the hands of the experimental design, like I guess, at the hands of an experiment designed by Penny and Andy Hudak is what I'm trying to say, excuse me. So I'm really privileged to have experienced a forestry degree. Every summer in Pullman, I was able to find a research field season where I'd spend the summer doing research with various groups, starting with Penny, of course. After that, I went to Oregon State, as she mentioned, and then I just returned from South Africa right before the pandemic started. So I'm really, again, pretty fortunate with this path and the career that I've had so far. Now, also, as Penny mentioned, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow. My funding and my support is provided by the USDA through the National Institute of Food and Ag. And our program is also supported with a little bit of funding from the McIntyre Stennis funding at WSU. So together we have pretty incredible support and have been able to leverage that to really build this pretty cool program called the Forest Health Watch. And we hope that we will continue this program. And this is really just the start of a career for me. And so part of the reason I really want to introduce myself to you all is that, I'm here as a resource, and I would be thrilled to engage further. I haven't really mentioned it, but it really is such a great opportunity to be here with you all, because you all, the perceptions and the perspectives that you have and the things that you're seeing out in the forest are really informative to us. And we want to know if there's tree health issues that you're concerned with, are there other issues that we should focus on for the next community engagement project? Those kind of things we'd love to hear from you all. So that was just a quick glimpse. This is our Research and Extension Center in Puyallup. And again, it's just kind of southeast of Tacoma. I'm part of a program called the Ornamental Plant Pathology Program. So we work with plant trade, nurseries, plant productions to ensure that they're working and preparing stock that's clean and disease-free. So we focus a lot on tree diseases. This here is a photo of a tan oak tree infected with sudden oak death, and it's a disease caused by a group called Phytophthora. And so a lot of research we do is about tree health and this group of microbes called Phytophthora. We also do some cool studies with Madrone. And here's an example of a common garden study that we have in Puyallup, where we're exploring the genetic diversity of trees in relation to plant health and sometimes tolerance to disease or resistance to insects, those kind of things. And we also have some research in Christmas trees. Then this picture here is a big leaf maple, which I don't think the distribution of big leaf maple reaches into Idaho, but some of the street trees around Moscow, you might see this disease. This is called sooty bark disease. Excuse me, where the bark pops off of the maple and you see this black sooty kind of fungal residue. And so this is a really important disease emerging in the west side of the Cascades in Washington. And the first report of this is actually in Pullman in 1968. So there's a good chance that the maples in Moscow may also be affected by this disease. So if you do see this, I'd love to know. We haven't found it again on the east side yet. We're also doing some research where we look for those group of microbes in streams. And so we use watersheds and streams as a early warning system where we can sample for plant disease causing microbes in the streams. And then if we find something that's of concern, we can go kind of upriver and look and see if it's affecting our forests. So that's just a summary of some of the other research projects that we have going on in our program, but we're going to tonight just specifically talk about red cedar. But I do encourage you and welcome you to reach out to me if you do have concerns or other forest health issues in mind and you'd like to see more research in it. I'd love to hear from more individuals in the Native Plant Society and the Inland Northwest about what they're concerned with, so we can do research that's generating information that's useful. before I move on, does anyone have a question about my background or interests or suggested plant diseases at the moment or plant health issues? Sometimes when we engage with folks in the inland Northwest, I hear a lot about fern engraver and some of the other insects that might be affecting grand fir and some of the other like Silverpine fir and some of the other species out east. But so Steve has just indicated and messaged me and said that bigleaf maple is in southeastern Idaho. So that's interesting. I didn't quite notice. I didn't realize that, but that's cool. There was recently, in the past 2 weeks, there's been a paper come out that came out of University of Washington linking the dieback of bigleaf maple to longer and hotter droughts. And I think that is confounded by this disease that we're seeing, but at this time we don't know the distribution of that disease yet. So if you do see that kind of sooty bark patches or where bark has been kind of popped off or shed and there's this black fungal stain underneath, we'd love to know about it. So I'm going to talk about red cedar, and to be honest, many of the places mentioned for by Susan and Penny, like where the Idaho State meeting is, the statewide meeting. I don't know if red cedar's there. You'll have to inform me. But I know some of the densest areas where red cedar grows is actually in northern Idaho. So it is really critical that we try and understand what's going on in northern Idaho and in other areas of Idaho where it grows. So I'm going to first speak about why Western red cedar is important. And to us, one of the reasons that we selected red cedar as the pilot project for our research is that because there's a lot of our partners indicated this is their priority concern. And it's largely because of the cultural importance of Western red cedar. And so red cedar is often referred to as a really generous tree because of the many gifts that it's provided to Indigenous peoples in the Northwest. So to illustrate that, we can search some of our historical societies and some of the archives and find incredible photos like this, where we see red cedar useful for transport, useful for shelter, still widely used for textiles and basket weaving and things like this. So we really know and we really care about red cedar because of this cultural relevance and importance for the Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. So red cedar is also often called the tree of life. And again, this just illustrates the number of products or gifts that red cedar has provided for peoples in the Northwest. And I've heard it referred to as the tree of life because you use products from this tree from the time that you're born to the time that you die. But I've also heard it be called the tree of life because there's so many and exceptional gifts that it provides. And I really like how Heidi Bohan illustrated this in her book, People of Cascadia, where just through some drawings has demonstrated, the spiritual relevance of Western red cedar and the practical relevance in terms of shelter and storage and things like this. This is a cedar bundle that was given to me, and I like to share this story. Although honestly, I'm starting to question whether it's appropriate for me to really share this knowledge or not. But the story that I was told is that if you dry out cedar leaflets or the foliage of cedar, and then you drop little pieces, you cut little pieces into boiling water and you breathe in the smoke, that it's really good for relieving symptoms of respiratory issues. And so you can imagine how relevant that is to today with the pandemic. But I was also really warned that you want to consult a spiritual healer or a traditional healer before doing, because red cedar is a really powerful species, and you want to be sure that you're not overdoing it, for example. But pretty incredible traditional example of some traditional knowledge behind the uses of red cedar that we don't have the privilege of learning all the time. And there's just an example that there's so much more knowledge out there about the importance of this tree. And it's really important that we keep this for future generations. But in addition to that, and it's really a privilege to speak to you all, because you all can see this every day if you commute through Troy, or you live in Troy, or you go to Troy, Idaho, where there's an active cedar mill. But Western red cedar is also really important because of this industrial heritage that it's provided to the Northwest. And it's really an iconic species and a founding species for many of these timber towns, if you will, which have learned to specialize, like Troy, in cedar products, such as fencing and decking and things that we really need, that extra durable, rot withstanding timber species. So in these photos, these is again historical photographs. This is from Ballard, Seattle. These are all planks from cedar, which were used for housing and walls and all this. And then these are what we would call shingles. I think they're also referred to as shakes, and feel free, please correct me if I'm wrong. But together, these products, the shingles and the planks that are really easy to produce. Western red cedar splits really easily and straight. And so it's a pretty incredible product that many of these kind of forestry towns leverage to grow into what they are now. So coming from Tacoma, I can say this, certainly where we have a really historical presence of mills, and the forestry was an enormous part of the founding of Tacoma and the growth of Tacoma. And I trust it's probably the same for Moscow and the surrounding communities, although the universities clearly are adding to that. But in addition to the cultural and industrial importance of Western red cedar, they're also really important for it ecologically. And so sometimes you find entirely pure stands of red cedar, and it's because they're often filling a niche in a forest where Douglas fir or hemlock or some of the other species cannot cope with a root disease, but red cedar has been tolerant or is resistant enough that it withstands it. And that's just an example of a process in succession where red cedar has a little space in this forest in its own. And in all these places, we often see red cedar on on riverbanks and near rivers and riparian areas, where it's providing important services like stabilizing that soil, but also shading those streams, which is incredibly important for salmon habitat and things like that. So red cedar is providing a lot of ecological services that are important to ensure that they continue. But in addition to in the natural systems where it's providing ecological services, it's also really important in our urban environments. And just to demonstrate that, with data from Seattle, they openly share their street tree data. And so if you pull out all the Western red cedar in Seattle, there's about 1,600 trees, and they're all over the city, where they're providing important services like reducing the effects of heat islands and improving kind of the mental health or the health of and well-being of the communities around these trees. And so if you're interested in the importance of urban forests, there's a really neat article on darkmatter.org called Trees as Infrastructure. But just want to illustrate that red cedar is also providing a lot of services in our cities in the Northwest. And we have a specific storyboard about red cedar in Seattle at that webpage. But to finally wrap this up, Western red cedar is really important because it has a really robust distribution. And I mentioned earlier that some of the densest stands or some of the areas where you'll find the greatest basal area of Western red cedar are actually here in Idaho. So although it's occupies a greater area here in Western Washington, there's some really dense areas in northern Idaho. And so it's really great. It's really great to be here with you all tonight. So this is just a distribution from these atlases. And then this is where people have actually observed it on iNaturalist. So it's almost, you know, just demonstrates that it's pretty accurate representation. So to summarize about the importance of Western red cedar, is a critical part of our cultural legacy in the Northwest. It's also a really important part of the industrial heritage and the story of many of our cities in the Northwest. It's providing a lot of ecological services, both in natural and urban systems, and it has a really robust distribution. So really, if something's happening to red cedar, we want to know why. We want to know what's going on and what we can do to ensure that these services and these cultural importance and the relics and reasons that we keep and we cherish red cedar remain there for future generations. However, there's a lot of growing concern. As Penny noted, there's colleagues that have expressed concern with Western red cedar, and that's because we're seeing a lot of dieback, and it's kind of unprecedented levels of dieback where we see individual trees with top dieback or the crowns are thinning, and so these photos are all from Western Washington, taken that I've been able to take, and I've been told that on the east side of the Cascades in the inland Northwest, it looks slightly different, where you see a lot more chlorotic trees where they turn a little yellow, or you see a lot more of this kind of thinning. So in this case, you would see a crown very, very thin in contrast to, say, a tree with a dead top, which on the west side, we're seeing a lot of trees with dead tops, and we're seeing a lot of trees that are just entirely dead. So sometimes it's a mature dead tree in a forest. Sometimes it's a thinning tree out in the middle of a field, or a tree with a dead top in the middle of a field. Sometimes they're pretty small, and sometimes they're pretty large. It's difficult to pick out the patterns. It's not a clear story yet. So just to illustrate some observations shared by community scientists. These are all shared from Portland, Oregon, and these are all shared from the Seattle area. And then these are from Vancouver, Canada, by this gentleman named Radu. And so I just wanted to illustrate that from Portland to Vancouver, same things going on. We're seeing a lot of top dieback or really, really thin crowns. And this has been emphasized, the concern is growing, and it's not very hard to find news articles about this these days, where in some case, Vancouver is considered an emergency when they're thinking about all the trees that are affected by drought. Are we in an urban forest health emergency? The question's pretty important when you think about the distribution in our cities in the Northwest. So just to illustrate, there's a lot of concern. This is also the increase in dieback and the kind of recognition of dieback is growing, and it's demonstrated by the aerial surveys, which our states fly in collaboration with the Forest Service every year. So state agencies, Washington and Idaho, I think, are different regions of forest health and protection, but I'm confident that this data is available for Idaho as well, where every year they fly airplanes over the forested areas. And at least in Region 6 in Washington and Oregon, they started documenting where they're seeing dieback of red cedar. And so every year since then, they've just noticed more and more. And that doesn't mean that there's more, every year, or if they're just picking it up more. It's difficult to determine that. But but we are seeing it the more places we look now than we were before. And generally, the consensus is that this is attributed to longer, hotter droughts, which makes sense biologically when you think about Western red cedar as a stream-loving species or a water-loving species. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of kind of complexity to the situation, and we really don't understand if it's just change in temperature, or if it's change in the number of days without moisture, and those kind of parameters are really important to explore. Finally, in addition to the concern, there's also a lot of growing urgency for this information. The more people we talk to, the more people indicate that they're moving away from planting red cedar and they're planting other species because they're seeing this dieback. And that's kind of a tragedy when we consider about all the importance of red cedar and the role that it's played for thousands of years in the Northwest. Are we ready to move away and start planting other species instead? Or should we rather explore some options by looking at genetic diversity and trying to pinpoint exactly what's going on so that we can better plan around it? And so that's where community science really comes in. So there's this sense of, there's this urgency. We need a certain depth and breadth of information before we can really make any kind of claims or provide any evidence with any level of certainty, if that makes sense. So we need a lot of information if we're going to try and figure out what's going on. We need a lot of observations across a large scale. You can see the dieback is occurring actually from Alaska to Oregon. So it's pretty immense area where we're seeing these trees with top dieback, and it's too much. There's not enough people studying it. We really need to engage more with other communities and try and collectively understand what's going on. So that's why we selected Western red cedar as the focus point of the Forest Health Watch. What our plan is that this program will be sustained for many years. And although our first project's on Western red cedar, our next one might be on Western hemlock or something, another species that you identify. So that's why I really encourage you to let us know if you're seeing concerns and you think there needs to be more research in certain areas. There's a lot of ways to engage with us in the Forest Health Watch, and I'm not gonna emphasize all of these, but I will say, like, every month there's dedicated times where we have question and answers, or introduction to iNaturalist, or office hours for tribal members. So every month there's time that we're dedicated to, that I'm there. If you want to come and ask any questions, you're welcome to come to some of our office hours. We also do every month these research updates. So tonight I'm not really going into the data that's being shared or the observations that's being shared, but every month we have a research update where we look at the community science observations, and we look for patterns, and we have discussions around what we're seeing, and we try and be really clear and transparent about how that data will be useful and what our plans are and where we're at in those analyses. So I encourage you to engage with us and come, and if you'd like updates about what we're seeing and what's going on with the red cedar information, we have those research updates every month. We also have a number of projects. I mentioned that, like, we're really focused on Western red cedar. So far, 1,200 different observations have been shared there. So 1,200 different GPS points, essentially. But there's a few other projects on there. So you can engage with us if you're familiar with iNaturalist, and I'll speak a little more to that. But if there's a tree health concern that you're interested in, we should add it on here and see if there's other people that also want to work together to document those issues. So now I'm going to switch and explain how community scientists are engaging and kind of what it looks like to participate in this research. And before I do that, I would love to hear if you have any questions or any thoughts at this time. Yeah, and sometimes we try and have polls, and so I would love to hear from you all. Like if you have used iNaturalist, maybe say yes or no in the chat. That would be helpful. Penny's asked a really great question, and it's kind of it's a difficult thing to answer. So Penny's asked if citizen science is the same as community science, and it's the technically no. Like the answer is technically no. There's a push for citizen science to be more inclusive. So a lot of people are calling the programs community science instead, but certainly just changing the name doesn't really make it more inclusive. So it's silly to like abandon the long legacy of the term citizen science just to pretend, to try and be more inclusive. But at the same time, maybe changing the title and calling it community science is somewhat more inclusive and someone's more likely to participate. We chose the term community science. We actually asked all our partners what they thought at the early stages, and it was pretty clear that community science was more appropriate. But generally, I like community science because I think most people that participate would rather be a community scientist than a citizen scientist, if that makes sense, just as a term. But this is a good discussion. I'm happy to talk more about it, Penny, if you're interested. So Penny hasn't used iNaturalist. That's okay. Thanks for sharing. You don't have to be a super technical person on your smartphone to share information. You can use iNaturalist from your computer if you want. It's just a neat, clean way to collect pictures and observations. And what's nice about it is we didn't want to make our own app or anything. So we're using an app that a lot of other people are already using. And I think that's a good decision, but I do recognize that it's not accessible for everyone. Sounds like Reed's used iNaturalist. Susan asked a really great question. I would love to. Susan asked if other like pathogens have been investigated, and so we can talk a little bit more about that. The short answer is no. There was some early on, a handful of samples were investigated by a pathologist at Oregon State, and to date that hasn't been further explored. Our interest, and we do have a proposal now to look for to compare soil microbial communities between healthy and unhealthy red cedar. We've kind of been waiting to hear back about that proposal before we start asking people to do that, but we will have our plan is to invite community scientists to send us soil samples so we can do that kind of comparison between healthy and unhealthy trees at a broad scale. We've just done some preliminary stuff, and we haven't actually, we collected soil samples here and there, but we haven't done any analyses yet. So stay tuned, Susan. It's a good question. I think that I'll show you in a minute. Occasionally we see armillaria causing an issue on red cedar, and it does seem to be like some of these kind of native pathogens that have been in the system for a long time that red cedars kind of co-evolved and adapted and survived with are now causing more issues as trees become more stressed. So we can talk about that. These are really great questions. Thanks for engaging and sharing your questions. So Steve, if you have a stand of red cedar on your property and you suspect it's experiencing dieback, is there anything that you can do? That's such a good question. And there is there's only one group right now looking at silvicultural methods to relieve stress on red cedar. And they're kind of looking at a few different species, but red cedar is one of them. So they're wondering, if you thin the stand and you reduce competition for nutrients or moisture, will your trees be more resilient to dieback? And we're thinking, yeah, probably if you have the means to thin around those red cedar, it depends on what your objectives are. If you really want to keep red cedar healthy on your property, then you might consider, but so far there hasn't been any research to say that. It just kind of is common sense, if you will, in terms of like what tree health, generally thinning stands, less dense stands are a little more healthy or vigorous than stands that are overstocked, for example. And I would really welcome Penny to comment on that, because there's other experts here that might have better suggestions. But otherwise, Steve, if you're able to like give some water, we at this point assume that would help. Seems to be, like a pretty plausible explanation that the drought is really affecting these species, and red cedar is one of the first species to kind of feel that heat or that dryness, if you will, because they love water. But it's also unclear how much water a single tree uses in a given day, and whether it's feasible for us to add that much water to the ground, especially if you have a big property. So sounds like a couple of you have used iNaturalist, which is great. I think that means you're ready to engage and share some observations with the research project, which I really encourage you to do. But those of you that haven't, that's okay. What we essentially did is, and you might be more familiar with Survey 123, but some state agency folks, Christine Beetle from Oregon and Melissa Fisher from DNR, and I think there's even somebody from Idaho was originally on the proposal for this. I'm just not sure. I haven't met that person yet, but between Christine and Melissa and another forest pathologist at the Forest Service based in Wenatchee, Washington, Betsy, the three of them had designed a Survey 123 project for red cedar dieback. And Survey 123 is based on ArcGIS, and you have to have an online ArcGIS account to use it. So they made it knowing that, and their plan was to have other Forest Service agency staff and other state agency staff contribute to their project to track or to understand where red cedar is dying. So what we did is we just worked with them to extend what they already made out to the public with iNaturalist. So together with them, they helped us create a project on iNaturalist. So iNaturalist is a smartphone app, but it's also just a web platform. You can use it through your browser. We chose it because almost 4 million people are already using it, and it has a really robust data set already, and it's a cool tool. It's built well. If a lot of people agree that you identified that organism correctly, then it gets added to the Global Biodiversity Institute, the GBIF data set. And so it's like already integrated to like give back and connect with other researchers. And it's completely open. So any observations you share on there, even if it's for us and the research project that we're doing, 5 years from now, someone else will also be able to use that information in a different project that they're doing. So it's pretty cool like that. Generally how it works is you take a picture, and you can just take a picture on your phone and then later go back online through your internet and add it to iNaturalist. But if you have your phone, you can open the app, take a picture through the app, and then immediately share it. And you share it with the community, And in some cases, the community might agree or disagree with your identification. You kind of suggest an identification that says, what did you see? And you say, I saw a red cedar. And then the community might say, yes, I agree. Or they might say, nah, that looks more like a Port Orford cedar, which happens a lot, which is great that there's that data control in there. But also in some cases, you might take a picture of a spotted lanternfly, and then Idaho Invasive Species Council might see it and be like, oh my gosh, did you really find this in Idaho? Let's work together to go see if there's more. And so there's some cool things about sharing what you see online, is that information actually is useful. So we created a specific project on iNaturalist, and it works a little bit differently, where you could search red cedar on iNaturalist, and there's 13,000 observations on there. The problem is that we don't know if that's a healthy red cedar or an unhealthy red cedar unless you specifically tell us. So we created a project where individuals would join the project. So you'll first create an account on iNaturalist, and then you join the project. And then when you're adding an observation, you add your pictures, and then it says, I think this is a red cedar. And then you tag the project. You'll click projects and you'll tag this Western red cedar dieback map project. And when you do that, then it asks the questions. It asks the really critical questions, like, is that tree healthy? What symptoms did you see? In this case, you would say the tree was thin. The tree was very easy to see through. It was extra thin, or the tree had a dead top, or again, the tree had a dead top, or the tree was completely dead, or the tree was completely brown. You know, we want to know kind of all these things. What did you see? Then it also asks questions like, was it next to a road? Was it in the middle of a field or in the middle of a forest? And then finally, one of the other required questions is, and this gets to your question, I think, is that Susan's question? You know, are there pathogens? Is anyone looking at bacteria or pathogens involved? One of the other questions is did you see any other possible factors that might explain why that tree is unhealthy? And so we look for things like, you know, please indicate if there's fungi or if there's insect holes or if there's bark beetles. And so, for example, sometimes you peel back the bark on a red cedar and you'll find that there's mycelium from armillaria, this hyphae. And so that's pretty important to know. Definitely a confounding factor and likely contributing to the dieback of that tree. So here's an example. We were out on a hike with some forest stewards from Redmond and found a patch of dead trees. And then at first we didn't, you know, think that there was a root disease, but then we saw some Douglas fir on the site also dying. So then we were like, okay, this might be a armillaria root rot pocket. Sure enough, we went and found a root on one of these dead trees. Has this, it's hard to see, but there's mycelial fans that are common with armillaria root disease. So pretty sure those trees were being killed by armillaria, but also probably worsening the effects of climate change. Other times you might see these insects. I'm sorry, I'm just realizing that I've been kind of going slow, so I'm just pushing through these. You know, bark beetles are pretty cool. If you peel the bark back, they have these galleries. You can identify what bark beetle it is based on the shape of the galleries. Pretty neat. There is a cedar bark beetle. Generally, we think it comes in after the trees are in really bad shape. But if you see bark beetle damage on a somewhat healthy tree, that's really important to know, because that might indicate that the red cedars, that the bark beetles are affecting the health of the red cedars. This slide is an example. I think that you switched with me and you're looking at a web page now. We have this dashboard on our web page. It's foresthealth.org/analyses, and every day this dashboard updates. And so you can go in there and you can explore, and you can see that we really need more community engagement in inland Northwest. Our understanding of the health of red cedar and the condition of red cedar out east is really limited. You can see that there are some good observations coming around from Moscow, which is awesome to know, and a little bit further north. But generally, our coverage of Idaho and our understanding of the health of red cedar in those areas is pretty limited and poor. So I really would love to work with you all to, let me know what you're having trouble with, or what other communities we could share this with, those kind of things, so that we can get a better understanding of what's going on with red cedar out east. But again, these dashboards are on foresthealth.org/analyses, and they update on their own. And so you can look and see where all the trees with dead tops are. Looks like there is at least one from Moscow. Where all the trees with thinning canopies, or where the trees that are considered healthy are. Or you can look at all the areas where there's more than 10 trees within sight that are dead or dying. So that's kind of pretty fun to play around with this. I think the last few things I have to share, and I'm sorry if going a little bit long, but we should have a couple minutes for questions, and I'm happy to stick around. But the last thing I want to just emphasize is how we're going to use this information and why it's useful. First is giving us a good understanding of the distribution of where trees are unhealthy and healthy. Before we did this, we had pretty limited understanding outside of the major cities that have produced news articles, but now getting a lot better understanding of how robust this dieback issue is. There's also some questions on there that we can look at the site conditions and try and pick out patterns of where red cedar are more vulnerable, or where red cedar are more common to be unhealthy. So for example, higher proportion of trees in these upland or well-drained sites have dead tops than, say, areas that are wetlands. But the sample size is pretty small, so come back to me and to the research updates if you want to look at that a little more thoroughly. The next thing that we're doing, and we're kind of in the middle of at the moment, is we really want to identify which climate variable is the most important, which environmental characteristic is the most important for predicting if a tree is going to be healthy or unhealthy. So for example, if we did a binary regression where we had healthy trees and unhealthy trees, we would try and explore the best predictors of whether that tree is healthy or unhealthy. And so this is essentially a modeling approach. We can actually do machine learning to kind of figure out which of the 250 different ways to measure climate data is the best at explaining if that tree is healthy or unhealthy. We can also look and see, is there a site condition or topographic predictor, like are trees on steep slopes, or trees on south-facing aspects, or trees at the combination of both of those, more vulnerable than other trees. And so trying to figure out which topography variable is the best predictor of a tree health. And then finally, we also want to look at soils data. We want to know, at a minimum, like, is soil depth a really important variable to consider when we're trying to figure out and predict where trees are vulnerable or healthy. So with this, we'll be able to improve the use of this really cool tool called the Seedlot selection tool, where I'm just judging whether I have time to explain this thoroughly, but it's a pretty neat tool where you can say, I want to plant red cedar in this spot. You can say anywhere within its range, and it will tell you, okay, based on whatever climate prediction you use, it'll tell you where to get your seed. But the problem is that it asks you what variable you want to base those decisions on. So for example, these are all the variables that are in these tools that we will test in our models. But if you want to base that decision on mean annual temperature, then it says, okay, if you want to plant red cedar on the tip of the Olympics for climates that are predicted for 2040 to 2070, using mean annual temperature, then we recommend you get your red cedar from like Willamette Valley, Oregon, this darker red area. But if you change that and you say, I want to base it on precipitation, then it actually says, okay, you should actually get red cedar from the Cascades or maybe the coastal region of Oregon. So this just illustrates that depending on what parameter you pick, you get different suggestions. And our understanding at this point of the parameters that are important for determining dieback are just guesses. Best guesses. And so with the help of you all and community scientists, we'll be able to pick out which of these variables is important for making those predictions. And again, that's with the help of some other experts in Canada, especially at UBC. They've created this cool tool to pull out climate data for any GPS point. So that's how we're able to really do this. And so we can look at things like, are there differences between healthy trees and where trees are dead if we look at summer heat moisture and stuff like that. I can go into this more, but forgive me for taking too long. The last thing I'd say is that once we know what conditions where trees are vulnerable and which environmental parameters are important, then we can really start to screen other populations against those parameters to see if there's better adapted seed out there and better adapted populations so that we can keep red cedar on our landscapes. For example, some of your Idaho populations might be better suited to drier conditions than, say, Western Washington populations and things like that. And I think it's important that we really try and explore those kind of options before we really start planting other species and moving away from red cedar in our landscapes. So it is really urgent, and there's a lot of concern, and this is a really important species. And the only way we're going to find this information quickly and on a big enough scale is if we work together on this. So I really encourage you to engage with us. Let me know if there's concerns from your side or questions. What can I do to help engage and give back to you all, but also ensure that we're working together in this. So thanks again for the opportunity to be here. I do really just want to encourage you, if you don't have time to speak up today and you would like to share some feedback about anything I've said or anything that you're interested in, there's this opportunity at foresthealth.org/share. I'd love to hear your perspectives. So thanks so much for the opportunity. Thank you, Penny.
Joey, it's really great to hear all the things that you're doing. This is really fascinating. So let's open it up for questions. Some of you have already put questions in the chat, but if you just wanted to speak up and ask Joey questions, please do so.
Yeah, let me see if I missed anything in the chat. I see. And Steve, we could expand a little more on your question on, if you're worried about red cedar on your property, what can you do? Generally, we'd say experiment, try different things, see if you can get some red cedar from a different seed zone, but then give us back, feedback to us what you find out. Try thinning some parts of it and leaving some parts dense and see if those cedar do better. Definitely planting diversity is ultimately better, because then you'll have more resilience. If you plant the same seed zone and the same seed, the same species everywhere, you're going to be kind of vulnerable to the one thing that might affect those species. But if you plant a lot of diversity, then hopefully, and this goes from like a population level to species richness, for example. But I invite others to chime in on that too. If you have different opinions or recommendations, I'm still learning. I'm not the get as much, ask as many people as you can those kind of questions, get a well-rounded understanding yourself.
Joey, it looks like there's a question about from Susan about she has some cedar trees on her property in Moscow. She's not sure they're Western red cedar or something else. Was iNaturalist a good way to get a definitive ID?
That's such a good question. So I should have mentioned it. We asked for people to try and add 4 pictures of the red cedar when they add it to iNaturalist, and if you can get 3 to 4 pictures on there, then we can be certain that it's red cedar. So you're right, there's incense in this photo right here. This is incense cedar. They have these kind of these cones that open up in these little half stars or these little triangles. But so there's incense cedar, there's Port Orford cedar, there's Alaska cedar, and there's Western red cedar. And they all, unless you're nerdy, they're pretty similar. But each guide, if you have Pojar or like some of these other incredible tools for Native Plant Society folks, they have really good descriptions on how to distinguish them. But generally the cones, if you can get a picture of the cone, then right away on iNaturalist, we can say, yes, that's red cedar, or no, it's something else. Red cedar have egg-shaped upright cones, so they point upwards. I can just show you as all what I'm explaining too. But the cones or the bloom. Okay, so here's a good example. Here's that incense cedar. I think you can see my screen, right? Oh, did I stop
Not right
sharing?
now.
Sorry, I guess I did stop sharing. Sorry about that. So here's a pretty good example. Incense cedar has these they're pretty big cone shaped while they're closed, but then they open up into these 3-pronged star shaped things. Red cedar are much smaller, but they're still kind of egg shaped. Where Port Orford cedar and Alaskan cedar they're like almost perfect circles. They're like little spheres. And so that's a good distinguishing feature. If you can take a photo of the cones. If you can't get the cones, then the other thing to look for is the bloom on the underside of the newest needles. On red cedar, it's really cool. They kind of look like little butterflies. And so you'll see this white powder on the bottom that is in the shape of little butterflies. If it's Port Orford cedar or incense cedar, they'll be more like X's. So that white. It takes a minute to get to the eye, but once you find those butterflies, then you can be really confident that it's a red cedar. And so if the cones aren't there, then look for the bloom. And if those 2 things, other general characteristics is the red cedar has branches that point upwards. The tips point upwards. They're kind of like little J's. And the bark is very stringy. The bark looks like it would be great for basket weaving. It's the best way to explain it. I think you can peel off really nice strips. If they're like really thick plates, then it's probably something else. Or if it's smooth, it might be a different species.
So
Great
you're
question.
saying that if Susan would take pictures of each of those characteristics, she would get and put it on iNaturalist, she'd get some feedback that would help her identify it?
Yeah. So you can, some of the better examples of the observations that come in there. We'll have multiple, like all 4 of those. Let me see. I think I have, so this is kind of difficult to get to, but if you go foresthealth.org/map, this has all the instructions for how to contribute to the iNaturalist project. So step 1, create a login. Step 2, join the Red Cedar dieback project. Step 3, add an observation. So you would click observe, and then here's an example of the 4 pictures. So the cones, the bark, the underside of the newest foliage, and then the whole tree if you can get it. So I think if you can add those 4 pictures or close to it, then we'll be able to for sure be certain it's red cedar.
So let's have one more question.
Okay.
I had a question about how would we learn how to participate as community scientists and what would I get out of it? I mean, clearly you as a scientist are getting some information from us, but what would we get from participating?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we're trying really hard. I mean, you all are a different group than everyone we engaged, and you might not need that skill building or that it might not add a lot of benefit to you to critically think about, is that a red cedar or is this something else? But we're really hoping that the exercise of participating is empowering for people, or gives that critical thinking skills. And so I would really welcome more opportunities or more feedback on how to improve what we're giving back to communities. I think trying to be really transparent about why this is important and how we're using the information is like one way that we try and ensure that we're not just extracting and asking people to participate, but we're creating a shared understanding about what's going on for the good of everyone that's interested in keeping red cedar on the landscape. We do silly things. We take, when we go out with youth, we have like incentives for participating and try and reward some activities. But yeah, let me know, how could I make this more beneficial to you all? Like what kind of thing would you like to see to feel more a part of it, and less that you're just putting data in a black hole and never knowing what happens to it, right?
Well, it sounds like you've been giving quite a bit of feedback. How do people feel like they have the expertise? How do they learn what they need to do to participate? How do they gain the confidence that the information they're giving is good?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it requires like kind of one-on-one engagement with me. I try and, I monitor what's coming in on iNaturalist, and will favorite a lot of observations if they're like have those 4 questions and they're really great, and try and give some feedback. But then again, if there's question with the data quality, we'll ask, and you try and like, often it happens one time. You give someone feedback like, oh, this might be a different species, or actually we might consider this tree thinning rather than branch dieback or something like that. And then the next time around they get it perfect, and you're like, this is awesome. Like, they're quick learners. People are generally pretty happy to they would rather know that they're giving good data than they would just add stuff on there and never hear back. So we just try and engage around that. Penny, you're asking like some critical questions, and I would really just love advice. We're trying to explore this. Sometimes people share 130 observations. Sometimes people just share 1 or 2. So we're not doing it perfectly. There's a lot of room to improve. And I just lean on other people's advice in a lot of cases.
Well, learning as we go is a good way to be. Well, thank you, Joey. It's great to hear about your project. We're eager to see some more input from our side of the world of the Western red cedar distribution. So hopefully we'll get some this summer.
Yeah, that'd be lovely. And in terms of like, how do you participate? We could have another follow-up, like how to use iNaturalist, and have more of a workshop. If people are interested in that, I'd love to do that. At this time, you can go on our webpage and sign up as community scientists, and feel free to email me or come to one of our office hours. Otherwise, we're here and available. And maybe at the state event, we can join you in person and do a in-person demonstration of how to use that naturalist. And so,
Okay,
yeah, thank you.
thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. And Joey, this will be posted. The recording will be posted. So hopefully there'll be other people who will see it and you may get some additional observations as a result. So thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.